Going on, everybody? Back on these YouTube streets, digital streets, out in the interwebs. Kevin Cole here, Unexpected Points podcast / live stream. If you haven't tuned in to the live stream, you're not getting much in terms of multimedia content on here, other than my face and some screen shares that I'll do today, talking about Bill James and how he's upset the nerds recently. I don't know if he's owning the nerds. I don't think he's owning the nerds. He's talking about the nerds who are trying to own him back. Well, I don't know. There's a kerfuffle in Nerdville, and so I'll talk about that. I think there's some interesting takeaways that apply well beyond baseball, of course, which is a dead sport. Let's face it. That's probably part of the overarching theme when it comes to. I'm just kidding. It's not dead. It's moribund, I guess you could say, for a while now. It probably goes into some of the overarching finger pointing and insults being cast out in all different directions. So we'll talk that. I did not talk to you guys last week because there's really nothing going on. I mean, we're in the dead part of the NFL season here. If you want me to discuss why, Aaron Rodgers isn't around, or, some clips from the new Hard Knocks of the Giants, and discussing with ownership what their identity will be if they don't have Saquon Barkley, getting stuff behind the line of scrimmage for -1 yards 3 straight times and then breaking off a 7-yard run. I can't bring myself to do it. I thought about it. Couldn't bring myself to do it last week. Had some other stuff going on the family front too. But I'm back this week because there was a thread. Actually, maybe I'm late to the game. Was it last? Let me check to when this new stuff was posted. No, it was July 2nd, so just a few days ago. So there was a thread this week posted by Bill James, which I'll go into all the different details of that. That gave me some content that I think we can branch out and talk about. Of course, I will take your questions here. So again, another reason to get on the YouTube, get on the Unexpected Points of YouTube, is that I will go through the questions and comments on here, as long as they're not too harsh, about too insulting. Although, a little critical feedback can always be helpful here. And honestly, I got to have something to talk about here. On the home front, I'll just tell you right now, your boy has been playing a lot of soccer recently. So far, I got potentially broken toe, a black and blue foot from getting stepped on the other day, and a sore ankle from rolling it. Not too sore. Luckily, my ankles are pretty strong last night. So working my way. So by the time I reach the 60 and over age range, I'll be dominating on that front. One other soccer note, and this is also somewhat related that we can shoehorn in here. If anyone's paying attention to all the different international stuff that's going on now, the Euros or Copa America, Ryan O'Hanlon, who was a guest of this podcast roughly a year ago to talk about this, talk about soccer analytics. What's his book? I want to make sure I get his book correct, because I was going to say a name, and if I don't have it correct, then I'd feel bad about that. Net Gains. No, it is Net Gains. That's what I was going to say. Net Games, Inside the Beautiful Games Analytics Revolution. So he had a good article recently at ESPN where he's kind of talking about how the U.S. team is just not that good. Like, the players just aren't that good. I think these national tournaments are a great illustration of this bias of overvaluing coaching, because it's the one lever that we feel we can kind of pull at any particular moment. You can't replace the players. In particular, you can't replace the players when it comes to national teams. You'll see a lot of these teams that are running, certain right or left-footed players in positions where you normally at least would not see them on a club team, who could, arrange their roster a little bit better, but they're kind of squeezing in the best players. You have players who are being kept around probably a little bit too long, because of the fact that you just don't get to view them that much. And you also have just bad soccer a lot of the times here, especially offensively, if you're watching. And I think that's probably a bias that keeps people out of becoming soccer fans in the US is that we end up watching, for instance, the Argentina game last night where they were playing against Ecuador. Just not good. It's just not good versus club soccer. But anyway, so the bigger point was like how you'll see basically through one of these national tournaments that there'll be a winner. There will be anywhere from 5 to 8 teams who kind of won't accept anything except for getting into the championship, getting into the finals. And then you're going to have the fan bases who are just going to pile on all the coaches. I mean, you would think that international soccer coaches are the biggest idiots on the face of the earth and are all like, it's similar to like all these fans know better than they do what's going on. I mean, are they bad? Potentially. But again, it's a huge bias that goes out there of what we can control versus what we can't control. We can't control how good the players are quite as much. We can control, using different tactics when it comes to being a coach. And we can just say, hey, you should have done something different tactically. Now, I'm sure there are overarching problems going on with teams not taking enough risk and vice versa. Maybe not sitting back enough some other times. But when you're in these tournament formats where any sort of mistake can be a huge deal, you're going to get conservatism when it comes into all these different things. And trust me, these coaches would get raked over the coals even more if they were from a team that was supposed to advance decently far. They took a little bit more risk in order to win the championship and then got eliminated early. That would be, the death knell for their career. So keep an eye out for that, because that's another thing we'll see with the NFL season is once we're locked in with the rosters, once we're locked in with free agency, once we have our expectations for how good players are going to be, a lot of our player expectations are wrong, especially when it comes to aging veteran players. Will be wrong. Players entering the second or third years of their second contracts in the NFL will be wrong. And then the performance of the teams, though, and how we view the coaches of the teams is largely based upon our preseason expectations of those teams. It's a very high correlation between how well teams outperform their preseason expectations and how well coaches do in Coach of the Year. And then we just assign, great coaching to this. I don't know. I guess I'm a little bit more humility and maybe trying to figure out who these good coaches are or who they aren't. I don't know. I mean, a great example would be like Dan Campbell. Let's think of Dan Campbell. I think he's probably done a good job. He's probably done a good job, right? Like, teams that do well on average are going to have better coaching than teams that don't do well. Now, there's going to be a much stronger correlation, a much less degree of uncertainty when it comes to teams that do well have better players than teams that don't do well. But even in the example of someone like the Lions, who played in a very weak division this last year, who had a little bit of a breakout to go a bit further than you think, even then, if you said, well, they didn't really have that great of players. I mean, they got Jared Goff. They had a 4th round pick in Amon-Ra St. Brown. They had some other players they have. Well, they've kind of re-upped these guys to all be near the top of the NFL and how much they're paying them. So, maybe the player outperformance that we saw was more important than the coaching outperformance that we saw, was much more important than the coaching outperformance that we saw. So anyway, keep this all in mind as we get into the season. And also keep this in mind as every fan base loses its shit, especially when it comes to the Euros, for what the coaches are doing on the soccer front. All right, let's get into Bill James and versus the computer guys. For those of you who may not see, I mean, everyone knows who Bill James is, right? Do I have to give Bill James's bio? I'm not a huge Bill James guy. I'm not a huge baseball sabermetrics. I didn't get into it via the Moneyball thing as much as really through fantasy football had being the bridge towards looking at things statistically and then just sticking in the fantasy football realm. But of course, Bill James has, come out with material for, I don't know, a couple decades now or longer, looking at statistics. And he's not, the highest level statistician or computer programmer or anything like that. And that comes into a little bit of the dispute that we're going to talk about. But he's been a driving force in at least educating those who then went into the game to then make changes. So not specifically him necessarily, but kind of being a godfather type of figure. The Bill James coaching tree, the Bill James analytics tree, if you want to say, not directly working with people, but inspiring them and getting them to think critically. Kind of having a folksy sort of attitude of this. A mainstay on as far as the Sloan Analytics conference at MIT. He'll be on there on one of the main panels every single year talking about this. So he enraged some people. And again, I don't follow Bill James on Twitter. Maybe he's a good follow. I don't know. I'm not interested in baseball. So, but he had something that got picked up. And of course, being that it's social media, that the negative, an opinion which can be interpreted negatively and dunked on is going to get a lot more coverage, a lot more engagement, a lot more promotion than those that may just be like, here's a reasonable opinion on something. Shocking, right? No application, of course, when it comes to politics or something else that we're talking about here. So when we talk about Bill specifically, and let me bring up his old Twitter page for those of you who are watching here on YouTube. I'll focus in here a little bit more. That's probably made a little too much. Okay. If you want to follow him at Bill James Online, you'll find him there. Followed by 129. Well, actually, wait, this is 2 people and 129. So I guess followed by 131 others that I follow. So quite a list here. If we go to the thread, this is again from July 2nd, the thread that he had that now it's only clocking 450,000 views. So it's pretty modest, honestly, which shows you how tied in it is into a little bit of a inner nerd battle that most people are probably ignoring here. But he had a thread about kind of where things are going and where they have gone, maybe in analytics versus his opinion on this. And I'll just read these out because it'll probably be easier than trying to paraphrase what he's saying and then come back to it. So let me read these out here. Again, Bill James, starting here, quoting here. He says, "My goal in starting sabermetrics was to use measurement and logic to address basic, large-scale issues about baseball and sports. Why do teams win? What are the characteristics of a winning team? How are runs created? What elements of an offense are most important?" All sounds pretty good. All things which probably less consensus about those things in the NFL than there is in Major League Baseball at this point. And I continue. Next, what is the aging curve? When is a player's prime? What types of players and what types of skills age well? What is a player's economic value? Why do franchises succeed or fail? What is the relative importance of the draft versus trades versus payrolls? All pretty good. Sounds good to me. Again, a lot of the stuff that I address on the site. I had a post about inverting the pyramid. I called it looking at free agency, trading, and the draft, and how you think about team building, relative importance of those things. Sounds good. All sounds great to me. This is when it turns. This is when the nerds get upset. Nerd on nerd crime here. Bill continues. We studied those with some success for a period of time. And then the field was hijacked. Now, again, this is Twitter, so we have to take something. When someone says hijacked, it means something to 1/100th of the degree of how that sounds. But anyway, was hijacked by the computer guys. Again, this is kind of reminiscent of Dave Gettleman, the computer folk. Did he call it computer folk? I think in something he was talking about. So computer guys. Going back to Bill here. The vast proliferation of and fascination with small measurements, exit velocity, pitch counts, pitch movement, launch angle, etc. So I'm adding in here. So he's saying that these things you just mentioned for Bill James, so he said they represents not the success of sabermetrics. So all of these minute measurements and the vast proliferation of these measurements represents not the success of cybermetrics, but its failure. We have fallen back into details. It is like our clothes have been caught in the machinery. It's an interesting one. It sounds dangerous. Of course, new measurements are valuable, and the process of measuring new things is vital to the development of knowledge. Now, I think what's interesting about that statement here is kind of counters everything that he said before or after this. Um, but anyway, I continue. And of course, my work has fed that stream or work as well. But that was never my main purpose. And at some point, it is counter to my main goals. Okay, interesting. Counter sounds probably not correct, but let's continue. The fact is that the development of real understanding about the essential questions that form the game, all games, has essentially stopped. No one really works on them or writes about them. At some point, our field must find the courage to set the decimal points aside and return to the study of basic large-scale questions about which we know no more now than we did in 1970. Okay, so that's the whole thing. That's the whole Bill James thread that he's talking about here. So where do we start on this? Well, maybe I'll start with the critiques of what he said by others. And, people can say whatever they want. People, it's Twitter. People can yell at other people if they want to. Although I would caution, or I would suggest, or I would advocate that we try to look generously at what people are saying. And we have this, friend enemy distinction, in group out group distinction, which comes a lot on social media, where we look very generously at the in group and don't look very generously at the out group, making it easier to kind of sort information, less cognitive dissonance, more ability to enrage and to quote tweet and move on here. What's interesting about this one is I feel like this is mostly a fight amongst the in group, but now what's even worse, what enrages people even more in some ways is when there is a dispute within a particular group. I think that's why you end up seeing, and again, I'll go back to politics because it's probably one of the easier things to talk about here, um, is why you will see things like, cancellation. I know people are like, oh, cancel. No one's actually canceled. Whatever. Attempted shaming, that sort of thing, attempting to coerce people. Essentially, I don't think we're trying to like rhetorically combat people, but really coerce people into either not expressing their opinions in a certain way or expressing a different opinion is most effective within the same group in a lot of ways. So, like a bunch of nerds yelling at Bill James is a little bit of like an intra group dispute, you could say, of what's going on here. And I think it's really set off by this third tweet in the thread here where he was saying the field was hijacked by computer guys. And I saw a number of people who have more of a technical background really jumping back on this. So I guess what I would suggest to those people is I know it might read in this like you are being spoken to or critiqued or criticized or attacked specifically, but I don't know. I think it's good when it comes to social media to give people a little bit of deference to the fact that they're not personally attacking you. Like if someone says, um, anyone who thinks the Bills are actually, anyone who thinks the Chiefs are the best team in the NFL are wrong. Now, and if you personally think the Chiefs are the best team in the NFL, it's not quite the same as saying you specifically are wrong and I'm calling you out for it. Now, people kind of take it that way and then they respond back with personal. Obviously, it's like if you quote tweet Bill James and you say old man yelling at cloud or something like that, which quite a few people did on this, you're turning what is a general statement which could be applied to you as if it's just tit for tat, like one personal attack versus another personal attack. And I don't know. I don't quite view them the same way. So I guess I would talk about that. And number two is I think we have to also understand that people are, there is a bias even amongst nerds to seek and obtain the approval of real sports people. Real, I'll put in quotes, real sports people. Okay. I see this all the time when it comes to NFL people or their proxies, right? Or the film guys who are like seek the approval of the people who break down film, even if they may not have been former players or former GMs or former front office people or whatever. Um, to seek their approval because we all enjoy the game. Not, we enjoy. We're all brought to this at least initially. I think. Although this is this doesn't quite apply to someone who won a big data bowl for who didn't even know anything about football. A couple of German guys, a couple years back, who just knew how to machine learn better than everyone else. So, like getting that sort of praise can lead people to do things where they denigrate maybe nerds because they'll get the type of feedback from those people who are really not even critically thinking about what they're saying. I mean, a lot of people who may agree with Bill James will be like, "This is great, Bill James." Bill James is saying that. Who knows, like a Michael Wilbon of the world or something like that, who could be a proxy for your, you know, more real sports fan slash player. Will say, "This is great what Bill James is saying here." Does he even understand what Bill James is saying? Probably not. But a lot of people will react in that sort of way. I've seen it in the NFL. I'm trying to think specifically. There was an idea of like we're way too confident in our fourth down assessments, and there was a big study that was done by someone looking at that uncertainty and how there's a decent degree of uncertainty where it didn't really prove the point that like you still need to make a decision. So even if you're saying there's more uncertainty, that's fine. Like uncertainty is there, but it kind of appeals to this higher authority of it. And that's why we need to trust coaches or something like that when the two things don't really fit together. So always be aware of that when you're critiquing people there, that that's part of their motivation. And a way to try and resolve this is to really dig into what they may be thinking rather than thinking that they're just attacking there. And then you can come to an agreement and move beyond, just the reflexive side, either side of this for where they may be on the issue. So what I think he's talking about here is being hijacked by computer guys is he's not going to be a practitioner of these, neural nets or high level modeling or working with the vast amounts of tracking data and things like that. And that's where we're getting all of these small different measurements that he's talking about. That it's going to come more and more into the NFL too. And I think there is a problem even in the NFL with the quote unquote proliferation of small measurements. I mean, when we look at something like I know miles per hour for a player, you'll see sometimes, oh, so and so had the highest miles per hour, the two top miles per hour. It's really just a marketing narrative sort of device that isn't that interesting. Normally, it correlates almost completely with who was the player who ran in a straight line the longest. It doesn't mean they're actually faster necessarily than someone else. And over a large enough of a sample size, you probably will be able to pick out the guys who are actually faster if they're because they'll have a higher and higher chance of getting that long straight run where you can measure them against each other. But you're probably better off just looking at their combine 40 times for something like that. Now, there will be more minute measurements, which take a lot of nuance and a lot of reporting on that you can try to compare, which are really valuable and interesting, which is not a proliferation of narrative-based stats that are leading us away from the truth, but are actually leading us towards the truth. And I think that's the distinction here. I remember when you go to the Sloan Sports Analytics Conference, you'll see a number of booths for different companies, not even knowing about these specific companies and whatever they may be offering. It's probably at least 50%. I'm not going to say it's totally fraudulent, snake oil sort of stuff, but it's measurements that we don't know where they're leading to. We don't know if they can be interpreted of actually adding value. And I think that's what he's getting into here. The more data we have, the more tools we have to analyze that data, it just expands the ability to come up with something that can be deceptive or can build a story to sell people on, which may not have the actual underpinning towards seeking the truth. And that's not really a problem with computer guys, quote unquote, hijacking something. It's just a consequence of the fact that there's just more data out there. The more that needs to be interpreted, the more that needs to be sifted through, there's going to be more bad conclusions. But there's also going to be more good conclusions or good data that you can end up finding and going forth is. And it all depends on what you want to focus on. Do you want to focus on the bad or do you want to focus on the good? And I think for someone like Bill James, it's probably easier to focus on the bad because of the fact that it's done by people who are doing something that may, like, whatever, it just sticks out in your brain a little bit more than it does on those who are focusing on the good. For instance, I kind of dunked a little bit, which I try not to do on Twitter, about some, like bad analytics that were being done on projections for different teams this year because the numbers were totally nonsensical. And that's just going to stick out of my mind a little bit more. Now, is this a problem with the proliferation of stats and computer guys? No, it's just, a poorly formed model that came out with conclusions that unfortunately some people will share without investigating it. For instance, the specific model that I'm talking about said the Saints were going to be really good this year. So I saw that like Nick Underhill, who's a former Saints beat writer who now does his own site on the Saints, like shared it and said, "Hey, look, this model says the Saints are going to be really good." I mean, the model's garbage. So but again, people like it'll get shared by these sorts of people, and so that's like an incentive to do this sort of stuff. There's plenty of practitioners who do something like that. But I think we have to look at is I don't see a disconnect between the proliferation of small measurements and the development of knowledge that he talks about here. In my opinion, they go hand in hand here. I think that if anything, the problem we often get is the inability to measure X or the inability to measure Y. You can't measure momentum. You can't measure heart. You can't measure, what the feeling is for play action passing or something like that. But if anything, the data and the small measurements work towards that goal as long as we're able to capture the less well-defined idea. The idea is not well-defined, but the measurement can be extremely well-defined. These two things don't have to be like, you don't have to have undefined measurements to kind of come up with an undefined idea in a way. So let me give an example. So one of the examples I've talked about before is play action passing. So I think there was some not poor. I don't want to say poor because it's done by some people I like actually, but there's a little bit of a disconnect by how we tried to measure the importance of play action passing before. And, like you don't have to establish the run, which I agree with. Or does a particular running back and their threat to run the ball have a bigger effect on play action or not, was the question. So, one way of looking at this that people come up with is said, okay, well, what's the efficiency running the ball on an EPA per play sort of metric? Let's look at these different running backs. Let's look at these different plays. How does it end up working out? Well, the reality is it's kind of like a crude metric for what we're actually trying to measure. So what we're actually trying to measure is how are the individuals on defense affected by who they're playing against, the perception that they have of who they're playing against. Okay. So not just the play action fake itself, but who the running back is. Like, how are they affected by it? How much of that translates through to EPA per play? I'm not sure. There's just tons and tons of noise in there. But when we can have small measurements, then we can get closer and closer and closer to measuring something, which is minute, which is a lot smaller. Closer and closer and closer to measuring the actual effect that represents the idea. In this case, the actual effect that represents the idea would say, number one, how are defenses exactly positioned on a play? That could give us an idea of how the coaches think about it, right? And number two, how does the defense react versus like different types of running backs? It's very well possible that you could have a bigger reaction from linebackers on a play action fake to one running back versus another in an equivalent type of scenario. And that would represent what we're talking about here. Now, it may not translate fully into the EPA per play when we split up all these different samples. But that would be a much more accurate measurement of how are the coaches teaching these guys or emphasizing for them to react to a particular running back, and how are they themselves, the defensive players, reacting to it. So again, it's a small, tiny, minute measurement, which actually links better to the big idea. I don't understand how you would figure out the big idea without the smaller measurements. Like, I don't understand that. So that's why this whole thread seems like a little bit of a disconnect that we have with Bill James, where the proliferation of the ability to make small measurements, I don't believe is the problem. Maybe he's saying the fascination with these small measurements is a problem, but it's really only if it's being used incorrectly. It goes back to the whole thing with analytics generally. And this is something that I'm going to steal from Kwesi Adofo-Mensah over at the Vikings, is that he just thinks of it, where he says he thinks of it as being thoughtful and intentional, I think he said, is how he thinks about analytics. And that's all we're talking about here. It's not you're not using numbers for the sake of using numbers. You're using numbers. And in this case, my play action example would be using, movement of the linebackers and their reaction in different ways. And again, you'd have to really sort down how you're going to get that. You're not using that data just for the sake of using data, where you could do a better job just eye testing every single one and processing it with your brain. You're doing it because you can do a better job processing all of that data and coming up with the conclusion that you can just watching with your eyes and processing with your brain. That's the reason you're doing it. So yeah, you don't want to do small measurements for small measurements' sake, and that's what can become a problem. And a fixation upon things for the sake of fixating on them because it's marketing, because it's narrative, because you're selling something, that's a problem. But often they are the best solutions. And a well-crafted solution using numbers is often better because of how much information you can pack in and compare over a long period of time that you just can't do intuitively in the same sort of way. And I don't know, when he's throwing out things about how we didn't know any more about baseball since the 1970s that we do to today, I mean, that doesn't even make any more sense to me. Or sports or these big issue questions. I don't really know anything there. It kind of went off the rails a little bit for me there. So I would say, Bill, it'd be interesting to sit down with Bill and discuss some of these things and to figure out whether he really has a problem with the small measurements or mostly how they're being used. And if it's how they're being used, then there's no hijacking by the computer guys. There's no problem with the proliferation of small measurements. It's just, again, how these tools are being used. More tools are always better. You just have to pick out the right ones to be used. And just more and more often, this is opening up a more useful tool. And that's why we end up using analytics. Now, to quickly talk about baseball generally, and I think this might be part of the larger discussion when it comes to people's negative opinions on baseball. Baseball's popularity is going down as there's vast amounts of, they have little computer companies working within each team of a dozen people or something like that, working within some baseball teams to work on these issues, that's somehow a correlated one by one sort of issue. I mean, I guess what I would point to, and I think this is kind of interesting for those who want to see, is at least the data that I can find on the popularity of different sports. Now, baseball was once America's game, and it looks like back in 1948, it's measured here. According to Gallup data, baseball was the favorite sport of 39% of Americans back in 1950. Football was only at 17%, basketball at 10%. So a huge lead there for baseball. A slight drop going in 1960, so a little bit over a decade later. And then there's just a monstrous drop between 1960 and 1970. It would be interesting and then almost a corresponding rise in football. There's not a lot else out there here in America. Sure, we got some hockey. We got some soccer, I guess. We got some tennis, maybe. Pickleball. You put pickleball on this thing for going forward. But it's really there. It's between 1960 and 1972. They have a pretty big gap here when it comes to their measurements here, where essentially baseball goes from 34 to 19% and football goes from 21 to 38%. So almost an exact flippening, whereas basketball is at 9% and goes up to 10%. So not much change there. So what happened in the 1960s? I don't know. I would assume television is a big factor into this here. I mean, let's face it, the NFL is a fantastic TV product. You get replays you can show between each play. You can get pretty close to the field, the impact, the pace of the game, everything that you're seeing there works really well for television. It's longer, but it's broken up so much that it doesn't seem as tedious as baseball can seem sometimes. So it's really just like television more than anything else killed baseball. And then from there, it's kind of a slow decline from baseball, going from 19 to 20% in the 70s as far as being the most popular sport by how many people, down to 15% through the 80s and 90s, and then now getting at about 10%. But really, that's no different than it was in 2008. And think of the massive changes that we've had in baseball as far as how much data is being used, how many people are being hired to look at data, how much has been incorporated, how much has changed as far as, everything else that's gone on in the sport. You can go back to 2003 and it's at 10% popularity, the same percent popularity that it is today. That pretty much skips over the entirety of the adoption of sabermetrics and numbers within baseball, and it doesn't really move when it comes to its popularity. So I think baseball, it just was not a great spectator sport, television spectator sport. And that's just what it came down to, purely. And it's only been worse since. Now, maybe the fact that it's more of a solved game and all those sorts of things reflects a little bit more upon it, but I really think that's it. And we're always fighting these old battles and pointing at, all change is bad change if it's within the larger context of a declining system. So all change within baseball is bad change. And one of the biggest changes in baseball is the introduction of numbers and analytics. So that has to be bad change if we're in the larger functional system, which is degrading. But it's not necessarily true. I mean, and also one thing to think about analytics is, it's all a net zero sum type of game that we're talking about here. If one team is getting better via analytics, another team is going to be getting worse via analytics. I mean, obviously, people will talk about, I watched the game, it is more boring. Well, maybe it is, but it hasn't changed that much, at least in terms of the popularity over time. It's really been the secular shift in television watching that went over to football versus baseball. So that's something else to keep in mind, because I think it goes into, and it also will play into some of these things about hijacking by computer guys and whatnot, is the way people see these things. All right, I've been yapping on here for about 38 minutes. Let's take some questions. So, Bill James, come on the pod. Let's take some questions here, and then we'll get off, and then hopefully there'll be some new, actually interesting stuff to talk about next week. All right, Dr. Tough Guy. As an analyst, how do you think about factors that are consequential to winning but not super predictive going forward? I think of it as something you adjust for, but then also pay attention to. Let me think about it in this sort of way. So, if we're talking about the NFL, so factors that are consequential to winning, but not super predictive going forward. Turnovers, I guess, would be number one. So it's one of those things where in an individual game or drive or quarter or whatever you want to look at it, it's going to be the biggest factor. Like, who wins the turnover battle wins the game. So you don't want to get lulled into thinking we got to win the turnover battle in this individual game in order to win. But you do want to think in the longer term of, we prefer to generate more turnovers than we give up. And there is a stickiness over the course of a season or a career, or a couple of seasons for particular players when it comes to turnovers. Mostly we're talking about quarterbacks and interceptions here. It's harder to figure out fumbles. Although if a quarterback takes more sacks, then naturally they're leaving themselves in a position and vulnerable to giving up more turnovers that way. Running back fumbles are a little bit more difficult to figure out, like who's an actual fumbler or not in that regard. But these things are important. I mean, another thing when we look at, for instance, scouting college quarterbacks, something that I've focused a little bit more on is pressured performance. Now, it's a bigger factor because um, the delta in results on a play when a quarterback is pressured is much higher because you can either take a sack, which is a massive negative, or sometimes when you're being blitzed, at least, and the blitz are correlated with pressures, you can also have higher upside on different plays, but it's not as sticky. So I think it's about weighing those two things out, and it's mostly about how do you think about sample in these, right? It's about weighing those two things out. In small samples, we downgrade it more. In larger samples, we think about it. We want to incorporate it a lot more. But it's also how you think about projecting and upside outcomes going forward. Is that you don't necessarily rule someone out if they haven't like performed well under pressure in the past, but you want to look for that trait, and maybe you're willing to risk a little bit more on shooting for that outside um, outlier, higher outcome going forward, even if you're not improving your ability to project a better median outcome. So I think that's another way of looking at it. Things that are highly variable can still be interesting, really interesting when you're trying to avoid the outlier negative or positive outcomes a little bit more going forward, even if your median outcome isn't as much. So it's really knowing how you want to build those different pieces together. Camden Caps says, what's your thoughts on the NFL Big Data Bowl? Ever thought about interviewing participants who didn't win but might have had interesting findings? Yeah, it is interesting. I mean, I've attended a few of the presentations at the combine. I think there's some very interesting stuff there. Although I think that the findings there and the way that the competition is designed is not necessarily to have a finished product that's going to be particularly useful or insightful in and of itself. They did take, for instance, the same people that I talked about. I think it's German. I might be mislabeling where these guys are from, but I think it was German guys who came up with a expected rushing metric based upon players' positioning and momentum and everything like that at the time of handoff. And then that was being applied to different running backs and others. And that actually did end up being published immediately on the NFL website, the advanced stats, the next gen stats part of the website. So that maybe that was a little bit more of a finished product there. But again, it's more of a marketing stats thing than something you would necessarily apply if you were inside of a team. But really what it's meant to do is to demonstrate your ability to work with this data and your ability to think and present the data, which even if it's not the best insights, being able to present it well is important because you're presenting it to people who need to be able to take that in and that feedback. So it has functioned as a pipeline of people getting into the NFL more than anything else. I think more than the actual incline of the actual insights themselves in these different presentations. But yeah, maybe because these guys all get hired up. They all want to be hired up by somebody at these different teams. They're the computer guys coming in. Wheels Up says fans often overemphasize outcomes and neglect the complexities of sports. How can we foster a balanced view of unexpected events and the limitations faced by coaches and or GMs? They care too. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot in this question, but I will say that neglect the complexities of sports. This kind of cuts two different directions. I don't think it's neglecting the complexity can is often used as a way of downgrading an analytical finding because again, it's like the all models are wrong, some are useful, is that you can never incorporate everything into a model. There always be missing context. So I think very often the analytical findings are accused of oversimplifying things, and they do. I mean, you're applying a model, right? Whenever you're applying a model, you are oversimplifying things by its very nature. Um, but it's really also about understanding where the quote unquote complexity comes from. And in this case, we're talking about outcome bias. Being biased towards the outcome isn't misunderstanding the complexity of what happened. It's misunderstanding the complexity of what could have happened, what didn't happen, but could have easily had happened. So the variance, the luck, the randomness, and just how wide of it that is. So it's not really just a sports thing. It's almost just like a life thing. Like once you have an outlook, a secular view of these things, you can almost apply it to anything. It's not just, sports, it's to a lot of different things. Um, so I think maybe it's like the variance is how you think about not being appreciated. So the complexity is as far as what could have happened and all the different scenarios that could have unfolded underneath the same players. But then also not overemphasizing the complexities which quote unquote invalidate models or things like that, and being able to judge the two against each other and say, okay, am I overemphasizing or am I using this like those? Am I using the fact that the model can't capture all the different contexts? Am I using that as a crutch to have confirmation or a bias towards things that I believe, or dismissal of models to things that I don't believe? So I would think about it that way. And coaches and GMs, I mean, they're getting pulled in like 15 different directions, whether it's how you deal with ownership, how you deal with fan bases, how you deal with the media, how you deal with the players, and everything else there. So that's why it's really, really difficult for them to get a view on this. Boxing used to rule sport. Yeah, I guess that's probably true. Why did boxing fail? I don't know. That's a good question. I think what's interesting is I would have said it was a similar sort of phenomenon when it came to being bad for television. I mean, you hear these stories, and again, you don't really know the correlation, causation sort of things, but you hear a lot of stories of when, you know, I don't know, Joe Lewis was the fight against, I don't know, what are his most famous fights? Let me look here. I'm trying to think if there's like a specific one I'm thinking of. Joe Lewis famous fights. Um, Max Schlemming, that's who I'm trying to think of. So I guess he lost to him and then he beat him later on, and it's like it was one of the biggest fights that we're talking about here. Good old German, Max Schlemming, 1938, everything else that was going on, the Brown Bomber, Joe Lewis going against him. When you hear about these stories about these fights back in the day, often, and this is why I think it might have it might have said that it had something to do with television, is they talk about listening to him on the radio. I guess it's pretty compelling radio. You wouldn't think it would be, right? But I guess it is pretty compelling radio to listen to a fight. And then maybe something was lost a bit when it got to television. But now we're seeing the UFC be very successful, at least relatively successful. Like, I don't think it's anyone's favorite sport or anything like that. Be relatively successful going forward. So I guess that is an interesting question, that maybe television wasn't as much of the problem as it was just a systematic issue with who had control over it, how it was distributed, a lot of problems with drugs and other things that were going on in the sport. All those things could have something to do with what's going on. But let's face it, as a pay-per-view basis, they're still getting massive amounts in the not too distant past. It was just sorted up into and very highly concentrated into a few different boxers. Maybe we'll get some big name guys that'll going forward. Although I think some of that is starting to fill into the UFC. And for me personally, I was kind of a little bit of a boxing fan growing up. I'm an old, so Sweet Pea Whitaker was my favorite. Pernell Whitaker. Where I don't know, I just can't get into the UFC. I mean, it's sounds ridiculous to say like violence, but I don't know, something like this, like guttural feeling of it is a little too much for me. Um, Thinking about variance, there's a lot more higher variance in UFC than there was in boxing. I know you can get knocked out unexpectedly, but um, it's not going to happen in the same sort of way with boxing gloves and no ability to um, to make someone submit. I don't know anything about UFC, so I don't know what I'm talking about here, but you know what I mean. So I don't know what happened with boxing. I would have guessed television maybe was part of the problem, and then the mob, drugs, all that sort of stuff coming into play. But they were still pulling some decent checks as of not that long ago. All right, that's all the questions here. I hope people appreciated this. Didn't get into too much NFL stuff. We'll hopefully get back into that next week. Subscribe. I guess you hit a bell on YouTube to get notified when these things are going to go online. You can come in, you can drop some questions in here, which I will answer. And of course, go subscribe to unexpectedpoints.substack.com. Tons and tons and tons of stuff are going to be coming in the preseason. And then, of course, advanced reviews of every single game, all that sort of stuff during the season itself. All right. Take it easy, everyone. And I'll be talking at you next week. Thanks.